Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Israel has felt like something of an extension of Washington, D.C. this week. There has been a non-stop parade of high-level visitors in the wake of the historic but fragile Gaza war ceasefire agreement. There's been the release of the living hostages and the ongoing return of the bodies of deceased hostages from Hamas. U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner seem to have become temporary residents of the country as they keep a watchful eye on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government and on Hamas, with an eye to the international partners that they want invested in the future of Gaza. Following President Trump's lightning visit to the country, his Vice President JD Vance arrived for a much longer and in-depth stay on his first official state visit this week. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to show up as well in the coming week. So what are these visits about? What do the U.S. officials hope to accomplish or prevent? Here with me to discuss this and to dive into the complicated dynamics of the situation for Israelis, Americans, and particularly American Jews is Haaretz columnist Joshua Leifer. Our conversation is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Hello, Josh Leifer. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Josh, what do you see as the bottom line message of this series of post-ceasefire victory visits from the highest of highest levels in the U.S. government? We had Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner visiting, meeting, having a big photo op with all of the hostages that were just freed. Then on their heels, Vice President JD Vance, who is still here as we speak, and coming soon, it's been previewed, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be showing up. What do you think are the goals of these visits, and do you think that they're accomplishing what they're setting out to do?
Those are great questions. I mean, I think the bottom line message that the Trump administration is sending with these visits, firstly, to the world is we don't trust Netanyahu to follow through on what he's agreed to. I think they have good reason to think that, and at every opportunity, Netanyahu has made it clear that he is unhappy with the deal and has grumbled at different parts of it. I was having a debate with someone recently about whether Witkoff and Kushner, when they visited Haaretz Square, I think it was last week or a week and a half ago, and the crowd booed Netanyahu, whether they knew that was going to happen and did it anyway. And it sounds a little conspiratorial, but I think they did.
You do?
I think that they are savvy enough operators to know that mentioning him in that context was going to elicit the kind of response. And if you watch the video, you can see Kushner smirking in the background.
I thought they seemed surprised but amused.
We'll have to ask them if we get the chance. But I think that they certainly knew that they were entering territory that was not Netanyahu's home territory, and that itself was a statement. And Witkoff has been pretty consistent throughout since he took on the responsibilities that he has, that he's committed to bringing back the hostages, even if as the Israeli government's commitment has been somewhat more equivocal. And then I think the third element of this is that the Trump administration, at least when it comes to this issue, has embraced something that I think I imagine other people have used this, but I'm calling like coercive multilateralism, which is that they want more parties involved in the Gaza ceasefire / potential peace agreement. They want to bring other forces, and they want to do it on the terms of the Trump administration. But this isn't just a kind of bilateral approach where it's Israelis and Hamas or the Palestinians under American mediation. This is a much more internationalized situation. And Trump and all of his minions are really explicit that Israel's not the only stakeholder in this, which is a big shift in terms of approach from what we've seen before, I think. And I think all of this is driving Netanyahu a little bit crazy.
There's a bit of a babysitter element here, which, subtly or unsubtly sends the message of, listen, Bibi, we're the ones calling the shots here. We're taking the credit for the ceasefire and we're making the decisions, which is just interesting, given the proclivities of Zionists to say, this is our country and we're deciding. And, it's got a very 51st state smell to it.
Yeah, and it has I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, it's funny, when one of the criticisms of the Gaza ceasefire deal is that when, the Trump administration unveiled the Board of Peace idea and Tony Blair's involvement, I think there was a lot of criticism of this is a neo-colonialist project. This is, subjecting Gaza to a kind of strange mandate, a U.S.-led mandate. It also is true that the Trump administration is doing that to Israel as well. Like the new sort of international consortium in Kiryat Gat that Vance was at yesterday, where there are lots of different countries there. It strikes me that Israeli actions are going to have to be run through this center vis-a-vis Gaza. So it's also the case that Israel, in some sense, has been put under a U.S. mandate. And it's weird.
Putting on your historian hat, does it feel unprecedented? I mean, we've had heavy pressure from the U.S. on Israel before in some critical junctures, but does this feel new?
I don't think it's unprecedented in that, as you mentioned, lots of U.S. administrations have put pressure on Israel before. I think what does feel disjunctive is that from, say, the 90s until now, U.S. presidents were much less willing to voice public displeasure with Israel and much less willing to put pressure on Israel. The big instances of U.S. pressure on Israel come from the 80s and the 70s. And in some ways, we're maybe back to that model where American presidents don't have a problem showing their displeasure and putting pressure on the Israeli government.
But in the past, Josh, I'm just talking from what I've seen, in the past, the displeasure has sort of led to a retreat, led to, Secretary of State James Baker famously said,
right,
the phone number of the State Department, Israel, call us when you're interested in peace. And this combines a critical attitude with heavy-duty involvement, deep involvement in what's going on here.
Yeah, I think that is the unprecedented part. The unprecedented part is that there are going to be U.S. military officials on the ground in Israel making decisions about what Israel is going to do. And, you could say that this is the cost of being so heavily dependent on the United States. Israel, in the first days of the war, U.S. military officials flew into Israel. They sat in the, I guess in English it's called the pit of the Israeli general staff and, made decisions with them. Israel was able to fight in Gaza with U.S. weapons. And now, I think for a long time, the Israeli leaders, particularly Netanyahu, thought that he could enjoy all these benefits for free. But if there's one thing we know about Trump does not like feeling that people are taking things from the United States for free. And so just as he's kind of done the weird extortion racket with NATO and with other longstanding allies, I think we can see what he's doing now in some ways continuous with those other instances, saying, look, you want, and Trump says this all the time. He said it during the Knesset speech. You bought a lot of our weapons, but now it's time to pay.
And it's a payback also for what happened in Iran, which wasn't, couldn't be taken for granted. The level of U.S. support, the participation of the U.S. military, it's kind of like, okay, you owe us. Now you're going to play by our rules.
Right. Yeah, totally. You want to be a proxy? Well, now you will be treated as a proxy.
To be fair, there's a lot of pressure on Hamas as well from the Trump administration. Trump, I've seen 3 or 4 times now, is, doing his threatening thing, saying if Hamas doesn't abide by the ceasefire agreement, they will be totally obliterated. And Vance even echoed that himself here the other days. There are elements in Israel, I would say, on the right, but even not so much in the right, who now that the hostages are out and the Israeli military doesn't have those constraints, are kind of itching for an excuse to go back in and do what they weren't able to do as thoroughly because they were worried about the hostages restart the war. Do you think this is just talk on the part of Trump, or do you think that if there's blatant, non-cooperation from Hamas in doing what they say they will do under the ceasefire, that there would really be a real green light for a real restarting of the conflict on Israel's part towards Hamas?
Well, it's not clear what he means or who is doing the destroying of Hamas when he says it'll be destroyed. I mean, he's one of the things with Trump is that he says things, and grammatically, it's actually hard to know what the subject of the sentence is or who the actor of the sentence is. I know a lot of people share this fear that, okay, now that the living hostages are back, Hamas lost its leverage in some sense, and now what would stop Israel from just deciding, oh, the ceasefire is broken, they're going to go back in? I think that what's stopping Israel is the United States' commitment to the Qataris and the Turkish government that won't happen. And it's always hard to know how the Trump administration calculates its historic commitment to Israel with its commitment to these other countries. I think that Netanyahu burned a huge amount of political capital with the strike in Doha, and that I think he's also part of what's happening. He's still paying for that too.
The forced ceasefire is a direct result of that.
Completely. And so it's hard for me to imagine Israel going back in. I mean, what does it mean Israel is going back in? The current situation is that Israel is in control of 80-ish% of the Gaza Strip. That's also a gift to the right in a certain sense, that Israeli troops did not, the war ended without a full Israeli withdrawal. That strikes me that if Netanyahu needs to spin it to the right, then the plan seems to be designed to enable him to do that, at least in the interim, before the next steps are agreed upon.
Josh, you live on the line between America and Israel, back and forth, and very contact with people on both sides a lot. What's your answer when your friends, family, professional contacts in the U.S. are asking you, what's the feeling on the street in Israel now? Is there a celebratory feeling of the war is over? Are people still, thrilled about the hostage return? Is there, reopening of wounds with the hostages who were killed on October 7th coming back and their stories being replayed? What does it feel like here?
I'm always reluctant to answer these kinds of questions because my communities on both sides of the Atlantic are highly not representative of the respective countries that they're part of. I think that in the immediate, on the day of the day the hostages returned and the immediate aftermath, there was a really big celebratory atmosphere. Not as much as I actually thought, and I had anticipated. There would be more kind of public euphoria, and I think there was, but the fact that some of the bodies of the deceased hostages have not been returned has this kind of cloud over things. And also the fact that, the Knesset went back into session yesterday, and immediately things kind of went back to normal. The judicial overhaul, Netanyahu inciting against the Supreme Court, things went back to normal really fast.
Normal being pre-October 7th normal?
Yeah. Normal, which is not to say normal at all, but it's kind of political culture war within Israel, where the government seems bent on kind of dismantling the existing order. They, even before, just as the hostages were coming back, the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, is announcing we're going to have a law that will allow us to alter the dates of Netanyahu's trial. They didn't miss a beat. And I think that whether that's part of their grand strategy of quashing anyone's hope, I think that has had some kind of effect.
So speaking of that, like you said, you're part of this very specific community in the U.S., which has a lot of very progressive Jews in it. How do we handle the paradox of having Donald Trump be the force that ended the war finally, held Netanyahu's feet to the fire, gotten the hostages back, seems to be working very hard to keep the war over. How do you hold that with the extremely disturbing things that the Trump administration is doing in the United States? Many of our friends are in the streets demonstrating against him in the U.S., while at the same time, we're at demonstrations here where crowds are cheering, "Thank you, Trump," and hailing his officials as big heroes.
Yeah, it's really strange, I would say. And I think that in that way, Trump has completely scrambled American Jewish politics because American Jewish liberals loathe him so much. And experience him and his followers, I think, as anti-Semitic. I mean, we see all the kind of Republican text message scandals coming out where they're racist and sexist and homophobic and anti-Semitic. So it's not like there is a shortage of anti-Semitism within Donald Trump's domestic coalition. And then on the other hand, it's true, he managed to do what Joe Biden could not do, and end the war and bring the
what everyone says Kamala Harris would have never done if she had been president.
I think that's probably true. I would say that my emergent theory of the Trump administration is that, first of all, what he's doing in the States, he announced he was going to do during the campaign and is doing immigration raids, sending the National Guard to liberal cities and all these things. Like, he talked about this. It's not surprising per se, but from what I can see from the outside and from some reporting, the Trump administration is multifaceted, and different people and different factions within the Trump coalition are responsible for different parts of its policies. So domestically, Stephen Miller has taken on the kind of Rasputin anti-immigrant purge hat, and that seems to be his project, along with other people. When it comes to the Mideast diplomacy, it seems like he deputized Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to get it done, and didn't really dive into the details in particular.
Jews on both sides.
Right, which is its own interesting story, the return of Jewish diplomacy. We have different strategies of Jewish diplomacy. Anthony Blinken also spoke increasingly about his own Jewish identity, the Holocaust. And we see in a way two different Jewish understandings of diplomacy, where one is consensual and based on a kind of rules and dialogue. That would be the Blinken form. And then the Kushner-Witkoff Jewish diplomacy is, no, America's big stick basically saved the Jews and guards the Jews, and now it needs to be used in some ways against the Israeli government to protect Israel's own interests. That, just to go back to Kushner and Witkoff for a second, one of the things I think we see in the 60 Minutes interview is that Kushner says that they pushed Netanyahu to accept the deal because they thought it was in Israel's best interest. That it's this kind of paternalistic, weird kind of American Zionism where, because Jared Kushner is Jared Kushner, he can say things that other people can't in the same way.
And then we had President Trump in the Knesset asking our president, Isaac Herzog, to pardon Netanyahu in a speech broadcast all over the world. We know that Trump is a big fan of pardons at home. I'm wondering, what do lovers of functioning democracies, strong justice systems, law and order, what are we to make of all this? And we have an interesting little scoop in Haaretz, I think that happened just before we're recording this, saying that Herzog spoke with hostage families about the prospect of granting a pardon to Netanyahu in the trial, and asking the hostage family members to promote the idea publicly and encourage public support from it. And we obviously have had stories from behind the scenes saying that Trump was asked by Netanyahu's camp, asking Herzog for a pardon at the Knesset. What do we make of all this as American Jews and as Israelis?
I mean, obviously it's grotesque, but also is not surprising that these two men don't have a particular commitment to rule of law and understand themselves as being, in some sense, persecuted by their respective justice systems. And so, it seems like they have formed a kind of natural alliance around that. I will say, I am no defender of Netanyahu. Netanyahu's corruption compared to Trump's looks small. And that is one of the weird things, I think, when you live in between. There is a problem in the Israeli political system, which is that as long as Netanyahu is facing this trial, he has a huge incentive to continue to destroy the country's legal system. And so I can see where Herzog's rationale comes from. There have been several Haaretz scoops about this. Like, he's been working on try to figure out how to do this for a long time.
And it's something you hear on the street all the time. Like, pardon him, let Netanyahu get away with everything if we can just get rid of him.
I hear that a lot, that people say, look, the corruption is horrible. They're all thieves anyway. I mean, look at the Likud, like the number of Likud MKs who are under corruption investigations is tremendous. The party is functionally like the mafia. And I hope I'm allowed to say that, but
we'll find out. If you're
we'll
not.
find out. And everyone knows that. In some ways, if pardoning Netanyahu means that there's a greater chance of elections to get rid of him, then that seems like I can understand why people are saying that's a risk that we're willing to take. But it's a sort of lose-lose, because if you do that, then you do kind of make a laughing stock of the judicial system. And, it seems to say, well, look, if you have power, you're above the law, there aren't consequences. That's the trade-off.
Josh, I want to close out with a quote from Jared Kushner, said in response to a question from Haaretz at a press conference whether the U.S. is considering starting actual reconstruction of areas in the Gaza Strip that are under Israeli control. And Kushner said, "We must ensure that the residents of Gaza can live in a prosperous and safe place. No reconstruction funds will go into areas Hamas still controls. Considerations are being made for reconstruction in areas under IDF controls so that Palestinians have places to live and work." I'm wondering where that hits you, both in the aspect of actually thinking about the Gazan Palestinians and their need for actual safe places to live and work, and that balance between Israel trying to control and help Palestinians and the dangers of the way that bends towards continued occupation of that part of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, when I heard him say that, I thought, okay, sure, there's this clause about self-determination and statehood in the ceasefire agreement, and it's something that the other parties to the agreement have been clear about. But this seemed to me like the kind of a proposal for the West Bankification of the Gaza Strip. In particular, that basically the areas under Israeli security control in Gaza, unlike to the east of the Yellow Line in most cases, would become a sort of Area B, basically, where the Palestinians have civil control, and that's what would enable the relief. That's where the kind of alternative, whatever,
the Palestinians, meaning the Palestinian Authority or this International Board of Peace or whatever,
kind of consortium would be or in other words, not Hamas would be the civil authority there. In the area that Hamas still controls, that would basically be a kind of Area A in some sense of Israel carries out strikes and occasional incursions, but it's not functionally under Israeli control. Turning Gaza into Area B is something that Israeli security officials talked about from the very early days of the war. So it doesn't surprise me that this is what has happened. But I think that it's very grim because, not surprisingly, it's for now at least the talk about eternal peace and reconciliation is really just talk. And instead, we do have an emerging apparatus of reoccupation, even if it's internationalized rather than just being Kogat or the Israeli civil administration. I think it reflects not just Israel's opposition to the idea of Palestinian self-determination, but also the impoverished Trump administration's conception of citizenship or politics or democracy, where Kushner says economic opportunity, business, reconstruction, but no, you won't vote. You want the idea that democracy is not an important part of life in that way. I think the only thing we can really hope is that it will be temporary. But as we know, in this region, lots of things that were supposed to be temporary can become permanent, and that is I think that is a really big danger. Hopefully, unlike say the Oslo Accords, where there wasn't a powerful countervailing set of interests pushing for it not to be temporary, other than the United States, here we do have the Gulf states to a certain extent. Britain and France and Germany and Europe that ideally, in like the most hopeful scenario, say, no, there has to be progression and eventual withdrawal. The second phase of the agreement has to go into effect. The yellow line can't become the green line of Gaza. I think there is a danger that happens, but we'll have to see.
Does that make you a little bit more optimistic than you would be otherwise?
The thing that keeps me optimistic is the internationalization of the ceasefire agreement this time. Again, Trump and Netanyahu both have records of agreeing to do things, saying yes, reneging, telling people to go away, in other words. But I don't know. I mean, I think that there's been good reporting about this in Haaretz. Something has changed profoundly. I think this is true, in how the Trump administration assesses what interests are at stake in the Middle East. Clearly, the Qataris, the relationship that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have to the Gulf states, that is making a difference, because what we're seeing is not actually what we were seeing with the Biden administration, which really wanted to keep a kind of much more bilateral Israel-Palestinians PA. Hopefully the PA can also get into this, and that would be the ideal scenario. I actually don't think that can happen if Netanyahu is in power. So in some ways, in order to have and this is where I become both more optimistic and less optimistic, in order for the ultimate goal vision that's alluded to in the ceasefire agreement and in the principles that the Trump administration and even Netanyahu has signed on to, in order for those to actually become real, I think Netanyahu has to be out of power. Hopefully that'll happen soon.
Josh Leifer, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your optimism and your non-optimism. Always a fan of the optimistic side, and we'll continue to read your great columns about all of this in Haaretz.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Haaretz columnist Joshua Leifer, and to producer Dan Brumer and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to hear our podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.